Welcome back, part two of the chapter two lesson. We are going to be jumping into the principles of collectivism. So, as I had mentioned before, the principles of collectivism are the foundations to a bunch of different ideologies, a bunch of different communism, Marxism, democratic socialism, utopian socialism, all of those pieces. Okay. And all of those ideological systems draw on these principles of collectivism in their society, in their organization, and in their government. So here's the list of six principles of collectivism that are very important. And they kind of have a flip side of the six principles of individualism. So each of them can kind of be linked together. So in individualism, you have economic freedom, right? Where you have the choice to spend money wherever, whenever you want. And in collectivism, it's economic equality, right? So everyone is on a pretty even playing field when it comes to money and economics. So you don't have freedom, right, to spend the money where you want it, but you do have economic equality, which means that you've got money to provide for your needs. Instead of competition, you have cooperation, right? So instead of working for kind of your own self interest in competition, you are working for the collective interest, and you are cooperating with each other. Instead of private property, you have public property, you have collective responsibility, and you have adherence to collective norms. So we're going to go through each of those. So, first being economic equality. So, while economic equality is a principle of collectivism, its meaning differs from one ideology to the next. It can mean any of the following: people with larger incomes should pay more taxes. All people should earn equal wages for work of similar value. There should be guaranteed annual income. All people should share in the wealth of the country or the world. People should own the means of production. Factories, companies that produce goods should be owned collectively. And then there's also the belief that everything should be free. There should be no private property. There should be no billionaires and millionaires. Many countries have tried to reform their economic systems to introduce more economic equality. In Canada, for example, we have a policy of progressive taxation, and this is often seen as an attempt to redistribute wealth. Right? So if you're on a really high tax bracket, let's say making $150,000 a year, your percentage of income that is taxed is higher than someone who is making $30,000 a year, right? So instead of everyone being taxed the same, right, everyone gets taxed 10%, let's say. As your income goes up, so does the percentage that you get taxed. Some thinkers have proposed that amounts of money are not at the heart of economic equality. For example, Gandhi, who believed in economic equality, says, economic equality of my conception does not mean that everyone will literally have the same amount. It simply means that everybody should have enough for his or her needs. The real meaning of economic equality is to each according to his need. So, all collectivist ideologies emphasize cooperation, a principle you are probably already familiar with. Cooperation can be beneficial to individuals and groups because individuals are unique and have different ideas about how to do things. Cooperation is the means through which members of a group or a collective achieve their common goals. It may involve designating roles, following certain protocols for speaking, or following guidelines for decision making. One example of collective cooperation is daycare. Daycare centers, healthcare centers, stores, credit unions are a few examples of enterprises that can be owned and managed collectively. Some of the guiding principles of cooperatives includes voluntary and open membership, democratic control by members, and economic participation by their members. Here is an art piece done. Um, the description from the textbook says in Alberta Cree First Nations, there are often protocols for speaking. A talking circle is a method used by many Alberta Cree First Nations to discuss a topic in an egalitarian and non confrontational manner. The group sits in a circle to discuss an important issue following accepting protocols and a few rules. Public property. As I mentioned, public property is the flip side of private property. Public property is anything, land, buildings, vehicles, not privately owned by individuals. Generally speaking, public property is owned by the state, the government, or the community, and is managed according to the best interests of the community, right? Public schools, public hospitals, parks, all of those things in our area are public property and they're owned and operated and managed by our community leaders. Some communities have more private property, some communities have less. You may go to another country where all of the beaches are private and you have to go or have a membership to go to the beaches or go to the parks. And then in other places, there's a lot more private, public property, a lot more parks where you can just go freely. Different ideologies support the idea of public property to varying degrees. In a communist state where each member is working for the common benefit, all industries could be public property, controlled by the state for the common good of the collective. According to Karl Marx, a very important person when we're talking about communism, he wrote the book called The Communist Manifesto. And he says the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. Marx and thinkers like him argued that only workers should profit from their own labor, not employers or the owners of the companies. It has been argued that not only is this arrangement fairer for the workers, but it also provides a source of motivation in the absence of financial rewards. Because every worker has a stake in the enterprise, they will all have greater interests in its success. The concept of public property is also present to a lesser extent in liberal democracies, such as Canada. Canada has parks, schools, roads, libraries, crown land, and crown corporations, such as like the CBC and Via Rail. Um, they are examples of property that the government manages in the interests of all in society. So, take for example CBC. CBC is a company that doesn't work for private. Their goal is to have more Canadian content, Canadian news, Canadian radio, as well as Canadian shows that are filmed and about Canadians. These properties are maintained with public money raised through taxation. So CBC Via Rail, though they do make income, their funding largely comes from tax dollars. Moving on to the next principle, collective interest, which refers to the set of interests that members of a group have in common. More specifically, the principle of collective interest states that while individual members may have individual interests, These interests are often better addressed by making them a common set of interests that a group can address together, right? So let's say I have a really big issue with the river being dirty, right? If a whole bunch of other people also have the issue of the river being dirty, then that's something that we can address together as a collective interest rather than everyone just focusing on addressing it as an individual interest. Collective interest is the basis for the organized labor movement, which began during the Industrial Revolution. As members of organized trade unions, workers were able to fight successfully for better working conditions and higher rates of pay, successes that individuals could not have realized alone. Collective interest is also the foundation for social movements and lobby groups, such as human rights groups, professional groups, or international organizations, such as the Assembly of First Nations. All of these groups represent people with common interests and goals who come together to press for change and reform. Moving on to the next one, collective responsibility. Collective responsibility means holding the whole group responsible for the actions of individuals or individuals groups within the group. Collective responsibility asserts that there is no individual action for which the group cannot in some way be held accountable. Acknowledgement of collective responsibility is often made in response to deep rooted social problems that cannot be addressed by targeting individuals or a single group. For example, campaigns against underage drinking often state that the cure for this problem must be a collective responsibility. On the other hand, the idea of collective responsibility does not always guarantee a caring society. Sometimes the idea of collective responsibility is used in totalitarian states, such as North Korea, where a strong central government has complete control over most aspects of citizens' lives and does not allow political opposition. In such a society, if one member of a family criticizes the government or its leaders, the whole family might be punished to send a message that the behavior is not tolerated. Authoritarian governments, in particular, often claim to be acting on behalf of the good of all, even when their actions are very punitive. Similar to collective responsibility, adherence to collective norms also is often used by totalitarian regimes. So, groups usually impose norms or standards on their group members as a condition of membership in that group. These norms can relate to conduct, values, or appearance. While they are voluntary, the group members generally see these standards as binding, which makes adherence to collective norms important. Sororities and fraternities, political parties, faith groups, churches, trade unions, and professional groups all impose certain standards of conduct on their members. Living up to these standards may be considered a daily responsibility. Censorship. Censorship means the deliberate restriction of information the public will see. It's another example of imposition of collective norms. Many media censor themselves informally. However, some governments have also imposed censorship on media, especially in those totalitarian states. And that is all for the principles. That is all for the chapter 2 lesson. I hope your chapter 2 assignment goes well. You can go there now. You can use the two-part lessons that we've just discussed, as well as your textbook to answer those questions. Good luck.